Well, it seems this is all for today, I guess. Just to remind you that you have to stay and watch the exclusive interview with the IMF representative in Georgia.
And to follow us on bm.g and forbes.g, definitely stay safe.
So see you on Sunday, and meanwhile, watch our interview.
Mr. Cakir, thank you for being with us and taking our questions. So the last review of the technical assistance program for Georgia is completed. What does that mean in IMF-Georgia relations?
Look, I mean, this was a 3-year arrangement, if you remember. Then we extended it later on to a 4th year, and that's the maximum a program can have, right? So we reached the maximum length. The good thing is it has been concluded successful. You know, we see it in the fund, but unfortunately, it is a successful conclusion on time of a program is rather the exception than as a rule. Now that it has expired, completed, the authorities already requested their interest in a follow-up program. So we will, at some point start in negotiations. We also have in between, which we haven't done this, our annual health checkup, what we call Article 4 consultations. And in the meantime, maybe before a program, we will try to do that, kind of check the pulse of the economy, identify reform areas, and then engage in program negotiations.
Do you think the pandemic will have impact on the pool of priorities for further reforms in an upcoming program?
Definitely. I mean, the pandemic, of course, impacted also what we tried to achieve at the start of our earlier program, right? If you look at our former program, the aims were also among the aims was fiscal consolidation, building more buffers, in the meantime, increase the resilience of the country, which we achieved. Current account deficit declined, fiscal deficit declined, but due to COVID, we had, inevitably, we had this rise in the fiscal deficit and then another rise in the current account deficit. So going forward, the program will have to take into developments in the COVID. That will have also, we will look into external funding needs of the country as well. And that will depend a lot on how the pandemic evolves, where the tourism revenues are. Of course, it will also have an impact on our reform agenda. Now, we see, as you may have noticed in between lines of our press statement and in our earlier statements, state-owned enterprise reform going forward as crucial. That will definitely be among the cornerstones of the program. And also there is a need now to reduce the fiscal deficit and the debt going forward. The fiscal rule requires Georgia's deficit to come below 3% of GDP by 2023, which means an important amount of fiscal consolidation has to take place next year. And of course, a lot again will depend on where the pandemic is, where the economy is. There is a need for further fiscal support. But I can easily see this discussion on agreeing on the fiscal deficit, the necessary measures as part of a new program as well.
Mr. Cakir, since you mentioned SOEs, I mean, we have seen your recommendation about, referring this state-owned enterprises, and the Ministry of Finance has taken some steps towards this. For example, it has calculated the quasi-fiscal costs of SOEs, but year after year, we still see deterioration generated financial results of these companies. For example, right now we saw that the railway had a loss of 164 million lari last year. So would you say that this part of IMF's recommendation has been fulfilled, and in what part has it been fulfilled?
First priority we had with the authorities on that part was the kind of improving the transparency of fiscal risks, right? And these include also the fiscal risks coming from the state-owned enterprises. The fiscal risk statement that accompanies the budget documents has become a very comprehensive one. Now, of course, identifying those risks are not enough, right? The next step is to take steps to contain it. Now, for that, together with the authorities, we identified a comprehensive strategy for state-owned enterprise reform with a technical assistance mission, right? But this strategy has to become the government strategy. Identifying it is not enough. It has to become the government strategy and be implemented. Definitely, we see a need to develop a comprehensive new governance framework covering establishing commercial objectives, performance management, and the principles for competitive neutrality, among other things. Other donors are also involved in that. For example, you mentioned Georgian Railways, Asian Development Bank, as far as I know, is looking into how to make the Georgian railways be more efficient. And, these SOEs definitely need to be better managed to become more efficient. And also, if you recall, there are some euro bonds of those SOEs coming due.
Yes.
So to give also confidence to investors, some reforms also need to be made to make those enterprises have better financial.
These euro bonds that you mentioned, Mr. Cakir, are over 1.7 billion lari, if I remember it correctly. Do you think these loans of SOEs might have an impact on state budget and also on fiscal strength of Georgia?
As far as I know, the intention is to roll over the Eurobond of Georgian Railways. We think it can be done. We know that the authorities are talking also to international investors and some of the IFIs to facilitate that. I don't see a problem in that. But for those issuances to be successful and also to bring the kind of the balance sheets back in order, a reform agenda has to be set and implemented, right? So I see them hand in hand. It's not only an issue of rollover, it's also an issue of reforming those institutions. And we think time has come for that. And that would definitely be among the pillars of a new program if IMF and the government agrees, of course, on a new one.
What can help lari stability in Georgia in the current situation?
First of all, we have to acknowledge that Georgia faced a couple of external shocks in a row, right? The first was the travel restrictions imposed on Georgia in 2019. Later on, of course, the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020. And recently, there are some spillovers from Turkish lira volatility to Georgian lari. Now, of course, an improvement in any of these shocks would help Georgia, right? But the most important element is the policy response. So in that sense, maintaining macroeconomic policy discipline, adhering to the fiscal deficit, the fiscal rule, and inflation targets, combined with sustained donor funding during the pandemic, we think will help contain depreciation pressures. Look, some adjustment in the exchange rate is to be expected when the economy faces a major negative external shock such as COVID-19. And while we believe the floating exchange rate regime continues to work well as a shock absorber, we are aware and understand that excessive lari volatility could become disruptive to financial stability as Georgia remains a dollarized economy. The central bank has a difficult task. They have to fine-tune between support to the economic activity containing inflation. They provide foreign exchange through interventions, but at the same time, they also have to keep an eye on the level of reserves in order to maintain confidence. So a combination of all these factors hopefully will help stabilize lari going forward.
A number of interesting points that you have raised, and I will have questions on each of them. First of all, what are some of the projections of IMF on Turkey, and do you think that spillover effect that you just mentioned will be maintained for certain time for Georgia?
Look, a lot depends on the authorities' policy response. So far, the Central Bank of Turkey has signaled that the Central Bank intends to keep rates where they are, that they will not engage in a rate cut cycle. But of course, the markets have their own suspicions. You know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. So the most important will be the central bank's rate actions and the authorities' policy response. We are also, like other market participants, in a wait-and-see mode. We don't have a program engagement with Turkey, so as such, we don't, in a way, recommend policy actions. We are more in the observing side of events. Short answer is we have to wait and see.
Also, since we're talking about the immediate neighbors of Georgia, there's one more interesting neighbor, and it is Armenia. And let me say why I think that Armenia is also an interesting case for Georgia. We keep hearing from the IMF in several interviews that the floating exchange rate is serving Georgia right. So I would like you once again to explain what IMF means under this statement, because, for example, if we take Georgia in the last 5 years, we will see that lari has lost around 45% of its value against dollar, while in Armenia, the depreciation is around 10%. And we see that Armenia is practicing some kind of like, I don't know how to call that, but kind of like semi-pegged approach. So in figures, it feels that Armenia is doing the right thing. Why does IMF think that Georgia is doing the right thing?
Look, I'm not in charge of Armenia, so I'll not comment on what Armenia does is right or wrong, but I can comment on what Georgia does. But if we think the kind of the extreme, right, say that all these shocks that we discussed, that Georgia had a fixed exchange rate regime in place when faced with those shocks. You know, I would argue that the National Bank of Georgia could have depleted its reserves to defend the exchange rate, and the country would be facing a much more devastating adjustment afterwards. Or the budget would not have been able to provide all the support it did to the businesses and the vulnerable segments of the society. And also the recession could have been much more deeper, right? I mean, I understand while we also appreciate the concerns about related to depreciation of the currency, it mitigates the impact of the shock in the economic activity. And the National Bank of Georgia is trying to find a delicate balance between avoiding excessive volatility through its foreign exchange interventions and preserving the country's FX reserves at an adequate level. Unfortunately, the future remains uncertain. You know, there is a new global wave of pandemic, new variants are there. The vaccination efforts are slow, so we hope that, you know, things will improve. But in case it doesn't, the country needs those reserves, right? And again, defending a certain level of exchange rate probably would have been one of the worst uses of the country's limited amount of reserves. So I understand the pain and I appreciate the concerns, but the alternative could have been much worse for Georgia.
You mentioned high level of dollarization. Do you think it is wise to keep dollarization policies during the pandemic, when we see that this is not the usual situation, neither for Georgia nor for the whole world, considering this depreciation tendency that lari has?
Look, the exchange rate volatility, I think, is very much related to the external shocks the country is facing and has less to do with dollarization efforts of the central bank, in my view. Now, the central bank and the authorities have, in a way, paused in their efforts. In the long run, it would increase the efficiency of the monetary policy. It is in the best interest of Georgia, but I think the authorities also see now the priorities to deal with the pandemic and its effects. The dollarization is not today's priority, and I think the authorities see it that way as well.
Thank you for that answer. And also, lari depreciation now has the spillover effect also on inflation, and we see that monetary policy is getting stricter to fight that effect. So at this point, my first question, do you think strict monetary policy is the right approach to the challenges that Georgia's economy has right now? And my second question, what could be more important for Georgia, lari stability and less inflation, or more floating currency regime?
Look, we think the national bank remains appropriately focused on achieving its inflation target, which is a cornerstone of Georgia's macroeconomic policy framework. Now, the most recent policy rate increase, of course, responds to elevated inflation expectations following a somewhat prolonged period of inflation exceeding its target. Now, the monetary policy faces a difficult trade-off between supporting the economy and ensuring inflation remains well controlled. Now, most of the drivers of current inflation are temporary in our view, but we also, of course, note that survey-based inflation expectations remain elevated. We believe continued adverse external developments, they happen, may necessitate further policy rate increases. These are difficult trade-offs, unfortunately, but achieving inflation target, keeping inflation expectations under is, of course, a priority for the National Bank, and we support that.
If we look at this new outlook, 3.5% economic growth for Georgia, what kind of signal that is for business community, for investors, for policymakers?
Global economy has witnessed the worst recession, right, since the Great Depression last year. And this is, as we always repeat, is truly a crisis like no other. So going forward, a lot will depend on the path of the pandemic, which is now shaped, unfortunately, by uneven progress in vaccination among countries. Now, in the absence of enough vaccination, again, unfortunately, lockdowns become inevitable, and these lockdowns have very negative economic implications in every country, right? Not only in Georgia. So when it comes to Georgia, so if the pandemic situation requires a new lockdown, then the risks to our 3.5% growth forecast would be to the downside. In other words, our forecast doesn't incorporate another lockdown assumption in itself. Now, over the medium term, we still think Georgia's growth rate will recover to slightly above 5%, supported by the infrastructure spending, along with a gradual recovery in tourism and external demand. But the pandemic, of course, will leave some lasting damage. I mean, if you look at the level of real output we expect in 2024 now, it is around 11% lower compared to the pre-pandemic projection we had for that year. But a lot, again, will depend on how the pandemic evolves.
Unfortunately, right now, what we see is that we see cases rising again. We already have a four-digit number again of daily cases, which is not a very good sign, of course. What should be the approach of Georgia if these downside risks still materialize, and if we get another lockdown? To what extent, I don't know, but another lockdown. What way does Georgia have to support its economy? Do you think it might need more debt and external financing, or do you see the room for example, raising taxes, where the so-called Liberty Act gives the government the chance to raise these taxes?
If there is a new lockdown, right, there would then definitely be a case for targeted cash transfers to households, and also to support businesses, right? But we think then in such a scenario, hypothetical scenario, we think spending reprioritization should be the first line of defense instead of new taxes. The capital budget in Georgia has been around 8% now for a couple of years in a row. That is, of course, important, but at the same time, in such a scenario, we see a room for cutting some of the capital spending and increasing targeted cash transfers to vulnerable households.
Yes, raising taxes would be a tough challenge, seeing that like 700,000 people are now under the poverty line, and also we see that unemployment high is mainly among those people who were before employed in informal sectors. Of course, that would be a big challenge and a big burden for the citizens.
Yes, we agree. We agree with your analysis, and that's why we think some spending prioritization is important. Now, it's also important to maintain the credibility of the fiscal rule, and the budget has been supporting for 2 years. But if another shock happens, I think then this time, instead of raising taxes or increasing the deficit, the way to go should be reprioritization among other spending categories.
Yes, and also on this note, what about some, I don't know, like better rules for administering taxes as well? Because we hear a lot of cases of, for example, VAT frauds, which have become quite frequent in Georgia, and we're waiting for exact statistics from the government to see that number. So, do you think there is room for improvement of those holes?
Look, I mean, in the program, we have provided extensive technical assistance to the government, particularly on improving the revenue administration. And the administration has evolved a lot. Making automatic VAT refunds was one of the targets of the program, and that is being now implemented. And this is important, right, to have this automated VAT refund system, because then you are providing also funds to private sector at a difficult time, right, when they are cash strapped. So I specifically don't know how the fraud situation is, but we think we are overall happy with the Georgia Revenue Administration, the way they have handled their own reform of the administration, and the way how the government is now able put in place an automated VAT refund program. These are not easy achievements. We really appreciate the authorities' efforts, and the current Minister of Finance also was in charge of the revenue administration reform, and we think he did a good job there.
You also mentioned that the vaccination and the pace of vaccination is like of critical importance right now, and we see that more people are being vaccinated in Georgia right now, but the pace is very slow according to the authorities as well. Would IMF want to see more active information, motivational, I don't know what to call that sort of campaign on vaccination for Georgia?
This is not an area of expertise of the institution.
I'm just asking this because nowadays it is so much intertwined with the economic growth, with the opening businesses, with less stricter lockdowns. And that's why my question comes to you as well as to all of the...
No question about it, right? I mean, no question. Without success in fighting the COVID, we can't have sustained economic recovery. Georgia is a service-intense country, right? In the sense, tourism and services industry has a big role in the GDP and economic activity. And without vaccine under control, domestic demand, or having tourism recover, these will be, very difficult to achieve. Hence, of course, it is very important. And of course, as IMF, we would like the vaccine rollout to be faster and more vaccines to be available to the country. But this is not an area that we provide advice to the authorities, whereas UN, World Bank, they have the expertise in this area. It's not that Georgia is alone, and they provide advice. They try to also help with the negotiations for securing enough vaccine, having the correct vaccine rollout strategy. Is the pace very strong? No, of course, we observe that. But again, this is not an area of expertise for us.
Of course. Anyway, thank you for bringing this context as well to our discussion. What about the financial sector and how the IMF looks at the financial sector? What do you see downside risks there, and how would you assess the way the financial sector is doing in Georgia? We just saw that Fitch Ratings has upgraded the ratings for the two for three banks, but two systemic banks in Georgia.
Look, we think Georgian financial sector is resilient. There are many factors for that. Of course, one of them is the good management of these companies, right? They should take the lion's share. But the other one is the Central Bank of Georgia is a good supervisor, and those banks were supervised very well before the pandemic as well. So that helped the financial system to face this shock with a better capitalization ratios relative to other countries. Now, that enabled also banks to keep credit flowing to the economy during COVID times. Credit growth has been resilient, and the bank recapitalization remains adequate, notwithstanding an increase in non-performing assets and restructured loans. We observed that the regulatory capital ratios declined by about 2 percentage points to 17.6%, still a high level. And also we note that the sector finished the year with a small profit, which is quite an achievement in a difficult year. Now, the buffers built in March 2020, if you remember, the central bank asked the banks to a preemptive provisioning of about $1 billion. We think this is still be sufficient to cover the deterioration in asset quality due to pandemic. We have to observe what happens there on the NPLs, on restructured loans. Of course, the biggest risk is slower than expected growth, further significant depreciation resulting in a rise in NPLs, non-performing loans. Now, we think that the pandemic-related policies should not be withdrawn too soon by the National Bank of Georgia. We understand that the banks will be given a 2-year period to rebuild their capital buffers, and the timeline to start this process will depend on the outlook for profitability and be agreed in consultation with the industry. Also, if I can connect with your earlier questions, and I see that times are very difficult. It's not easy for Georgia, but the way I see it, if Georgia managed to come out of this pandemic with still a healthy financial system, with adequate foreign exchange reserves, despite a depreciated exchange rate and of course a slowdown in the activity, it is still not a bad outcome, right? But of course, it is too soon to talk about those before the end of the pandemic. Still has to play out, and we have to see all its impact on the economy and in financial sector. But we would say so far so good on that.
Thank you for your time. We have been talking for half an hour now. Thank you for that.
Elena, thank you for your questions and the opportunity. As always.
We are BMG. Follow and subscribe for business and economics news.